I'm undressed and bound to a testing table when my family comes to pick me up. A thick, sharp needle pierces into my neck. A drug is administered into my blood, and the pain almost makes me lose consciousness. Behind me, I can feel a man's cold hand stroking my skin amorously. Before me, several people are staring at me. They point at me and treat me like an educational instrument. I tremble in fear and curl up on the testing table in pain. 3 years ago, my brother sent me to my Cora's war zone to stand up for Yvette Sanders. Those were the 3 most insulting and torturous years of my life. They burned away my hope for kinship, but not my desire for survival. As the hands roam lower on my body, I bite my lip so hard that I almost draw blood. As the hands start to go overboard, someone knocks on the door. Wendy Sanders, your brother is here for you. I looked up in confusion, wondering if I'd misheard it. It wasn't until I was actually sent back to Sundale City, and saw that familiar figure in the airport, that my numb heart started throbbing painfully. 3 years ago, Yvette Sanders had made her grand return as the actual daughter of the Sanders family. As for me, the fake daughter who had occupied her place for 20 years, I'd naturally come crashing down from the heights where I'd once been. Although my family had promised that they would treat me the same as before, even though I wasn't their biological daughter, I'd still ended up in my Cora's war zone 3 months later. When I'd accidentally hurt Yvette while setting her bones, they had criticized my medical skills, and sent me there to improve myself. From then, I'd become the lowest of the low in the war zone, a test subject for experimental drugs. I'd been left with countless illnesses from the drug testing, and my skin was marked with numerous needle marks and scars. Even my kneecaps and hand bones had been dislocated and reattached. And since I'd been one of the few women in the military camp, I'd often been taken advantage of under the guise of drug testing, enduring endless humiliation. If Connor Sanders had said he was taking me home 3 years ago, I would have been moved to tears, whining and clinging to him. But now, it took everything in me to keep myself from running away when I saw him in person. I sat as far away from him as possible and softly said, "Thanks for picking me up, Mr. Sanders." Connor frowned. "I'm your brother. It's only been 3 years, yet you can't even bring yourself to call me Connie anymore?" I was stunned. I'd been calling him Connie for over 20 years. He was my brother who would stay by my side when I was sick, and would tirelessly prepare me gifts for my birthdays. However, he was also the one who'd slapped me repeatedly just to vent out Yvette's anger. He'd also left me to fend for myself in my Cora's war zone for 3 years. It wasn't that I refused to call him Connie. It was just that the past 3 years had made me realize that he no longer was the family I could freely seek affection from. Connor was still looking at me, seemingly waiting for an explanation, but I only lowered my head and replied, "I'm sorry, Mr. Sanders." His frown deepened. He was about to speak up when he caught sight of the still healing needle marks on my neck. He paused for a moment before reaching out toward me. "What's this?" I instinctively flinched away from Connor's hand. This was something that had never happened before. His hand missed and fell, and his expression darkened instantly. "I'm just trying to look out for you, Wendy, and this is how you're acting." I turned my gaze downward and calmly said, "We're not biological siblings after all, Mr. Sanders. It's not appropriate for us to be this intimate." Connor was stunned by my words. His anger flared soon after. "Are you blaming us now? You've enjoyed 20 years of comfort in the Sanders residence, living in Yvette's place. We sent you away for you to improve your medical skills for your own good, and now you're holding it against us. It seems like you haven't learned your lesson in the past 3 years. Since you're acting so high and mighty." The next moment, the car door opened, and I was kicked out by Connor. He spat, "You can crawl back from here then, you ungrateful brat." I was kicked out of the moving car without warning, and sent crashing onto the ground hard. The sharp pain sent a wave of dizziness through me. Even so, I stumbled to my feet, instinctively popping my dislocated hand bones and kneecap back into place. I then slowly made my way down the familiar path I'd walked countless times before. I still needed to return to the Sanders residence to retrieve something. Compared to what I'd felt in the past 3 years, this little bit of pain couldn't do anything to stop me. By the time I staggered back to the Sanders residence, Connor was already sitting in the living room. Meanwhile, Mom, whom I hadn't met for 3 years, was currently hugging a coquettish Yvette. She had a soft smile on her face. However, the first to notice me was Yvette. "Wendy's back." She linked arms with Mom and walked over cheerfully. Mom was initially surprised to see me before tearing up in a heartbroken manner. "How did things end up like this?" "Connor too. I'd asked him to pick you up, yet he came back on his own. Why didn't you listen to me?" Connor coldly looked at me. "Don't you hate us? Yet you ended up coming back anyway. Is there any meaning to all your games, Wendy?" Yvette playfully rolled her eyes at him. "How could you talk to Wendy like that, Connie? It's only natural for her to have some complaints now that she's finally made her way back." Connor's gaze immediately softened when he turned to her. "I know you're kind enough to treat her like your sister, but she might not appreciate it." I quietly watched the happy family before me. Even though I'd prepared myself for it, I still felt a sharp pain in my chest. After a while, I slowly said, "It's been a while, Mrs. Sanders." Mom covered her mouth in disbelief. There were tears in her eyes when she said, "Why aren't you calling me Mom anymore, Wendy? I've told you before, even if you're not my biological daughter, I'll still treat you." I interrupted her and said calmly, "Your daughter has already returned, Mrs. Sanders. It's no longer appropriate for me to keep calling you that." Dejected, Mom reached out to caress my face. "Don't treat me like this, Wendy. I'll feel sad." I backed away to avoid her touch, but Connor kicked me in the stomach once again. He spat, "It's one thing if you treat me this way, but you're even treating Mom like this. Do you want to die? You're stirring things up as soon as you're back." "Listen, Wendy, we don't owe you anything," Yvette said with teary eyes. "Do you blame me for coming back and taking over your place, Wendy? But I can't help it. I really wanted a family." I collapsed onto the floor. The pain from my old injuries flared up from Connor's kick, making me black out for a moment. Unable to hold it in any longer, I spat out a mouthful of black blood. Mom gasped and tried to help me up. Connor's expression faltered, yet he still scolded me harshly. You suck at pretending. You're even spitting out black blood? Do you think you're acting? I couldn't say a word, and I didn't want Mom to touch me. As such, I could only back away desperately. A familiar voice sounded as we were stuck in a standstill. What's with all the commotion? Don't you know we have a guest coming over today? I slowly turned around and saw that Dad had returned. He was currently frowning at me, his face etched with disdain. I wiped the blood away from the corners of my lips and obediently greeted him. Hello, Mr. Sanders. Dad was stunned. He had a complex expression and didn't respond to me. However, the person beside him chuckled and teased. You're still pampered as ever. I looked up immediately, staring at the familiar figure beside Dad in shock. The humiliation and pain I'd suffered in the past 3 years came rushing up in an instant. The warmth drained from my body as the familiar sense of fear and dread filled me. Why? Why was he here? The man slowly walked over and helped me up. A wave of disgust washed over me as his palm touched my skin. I shook him off with all my might and uttered through gritted teeth, Liam. Liam Lancelot chuckled, his fingers casually brushing against my cheek. Long time no see. I started breathing laboriously. I couldn't understand why I still couldn't escape this demon when I had already left that hellish place. Dad looked at me, clearly displeased. Why are you being so rude? Is this how you treat the benefactor who took care of you for the past 3 years? Benefactor? If he was my benefactor, then what was I supposed to make of these scars all over me? I let out a mocking laugh, yet my body trembled uncontrollably. I couldn't be sure if it was out of anger or disgust. Mom also stepped forward to persuade me. We asked Liam to take care of you the past 3 years you were in my Cora's war zone. It's all thanks to him that you were able to come back safely, Wendy. You shouldn't repay kindness with ingratitude. Connor mocked. Hasn't she done enough to repay kindness with ingratitude? We raised her for decades, yet she's still treating us like we're strangers. My eyes widened, and I nearly lost my balance. This demon had tormented me endlessly for the past 3 years, yet he'd actually been placed by my side by those I'd once thought of as my most beloved family. I instinctively backed away, yet Yvette grabbed my arm and dragged me over to Liam. That's right, Wendy. Even though Mom and Dad sent you over to such a dangerous place, they were still worried about you. So they arranged a backup plan for you. You shouldn't blame Mom, Dad, and Connie anymore. We're still family. I found her words hilarious. Unable to hold back any longer, I started to retch. Yvette was surprised. She asked in an aggrieved manner, Do you hate me so much, Wendy? The others started scolding me after that. Don't go overboard, Wendy. If you no longer want to stay in the Sanders residence, then leave. A vicious person like you is not welcomed here. I took a deep breath and ignored the malicious glare Liam shot me. I then said, Indeed, I shouldn't stay in the Sanders residence any longer. I paused before glancing over to Yvette, who was in Connor's arms. I heard that the Lorenzos are your adoptive parents. I suppose they're my biological parents then. From now onward, I'll call myself Wendy Lorenzo, not Wendy Sanders. The Sanders were all shocked when they heard what I said. They knew how much I used to care about them. In the past, I'd rather be sent to my Cora's war zone than leave their side. But now, I had been the first to propose severing ties. How could they not be shocked? Mom was the first to react. She looked at me sadly and asked, Have you decided to abandon us, Wendy? However, Connor was filled with disbelief. He snorted, Aren't you just trying to grab our attention by doing this, Wendy? You'd better tone it down. Don't end up regretting it when things go too far and start crying to come back. I looked at him without much emotion. That won't happen. I won't be coming back here anymore. Connor was stunned. A hint of panic crossed his eyes. Mom took my hand as tears fell down her face uncontrollably. You're my daughter, Wendy. I won't let you leave. Dad looked at me and said sternly, Stop messing around. You'll always be part of the Sanders family. Liam said that the two of you have been in love for the past 3 years. He's here to talk about your marriage today. Even though you're not my biological daughter, you still have the chance to marry as a Sanders. What more could you want?